Thank you, and we've got a full house here. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to attend the session, and thank you to a great team of panelists here who will be looking into the question of Japan passing to Japan surpassing. For any of you who attended Jesper's session downstairs prior to this, Jesper made the comment, Japan has arrived. Of course, Jesper has been saying Japan has arrived for 30 years. The difference now is that a lot of people are actually beginning to agree with him, which is great. And they looked at it very much from the perspective of companies, management, and economics. And so perhaps we'll try and broaden that out a little bit in this session. From my perspective, it's been interesting for me to observe that probably since about 4 to 5 months ago, every couple of weeks, I get an email from what are some pretty major sporting teams from around the world, from basketball in the US to soccer or football, depending on where you come from, to rugby, all asking, would Nomura like to sponsor them? And we haven't seen that before, and I'm not really quite sure whether this is because it's suddenly maybe people in other parts of the world are not putting up sponsorship money and they're coming to Japan, or whether it's part of a realization that Japanese sports fans are now more internationalized and interested in following different sports from different teams from around the world. Or whether it's just a perception that Japan has a lot of money to spend at the moment. I'm not quite sure what the reason is, but it's quite a compelling and interesting experience for me to be seeing in terms of renewed interest in Japan. So let's ask our panelists, are you seeing what we might call renewed interest in Japan? And do you think it is sustainable? And what do you think might be driving it? Toda-san.
Hi, nice to meet you all. Thank you very much for having me. Yes, to answer your question, or the first part, I've seen they got a renewed interest in Japan. I joined the Reuters 1.5 years ago, and before that, I was with Japanese agency for more than 20 years. Now you see my age, right? But anyway, so our main job over there is to kind of, to cover and report about the country, which is kind of quite for the changes, but they never capitalized, the real momentum, for the changes. So kind of, there's a word, that lost 10 years after bubble economy burst, but it's become the 20 years and more. So kind of, actually, when I got the job from the Reuters, one of my future bosses told me, hey, Yukiko, you can have the luxury to pick up your own kind of a topic and do more investigative work because Japan is such a boring place. And, the market is kind of boring, but, which is to be proved to be wrong when I joined the Reuters. And because I have to chase after news, which is kind of world moving sometimes, including the assassination of Prime Minister Abe and also the historic depreciation of the yen. So in the series of the coverage, I feel the very strong interest from the international readers as well. And there are some drivers, maybe, which causes those kind of, momentum. And I think as everybody maybe discussed in the before session, I think, of course, there's a very special kind of monetary policy of the BOJ, which is an outlier, among the central banks, which is kind of entered into the, the combat against the inflation. But in Japan, there's a kind of, low rate interest rates. And as a result, it causes the weak yen. So it makes Japanese asset, including the real estate, relatively very reasonable. And there's a geopolitical factor as a second reason, including the Ukraine war and also the US-China rivalry. So Japan, is kind of strongly aligned with the Western country, including G7. Kind of it became the reliable kind of partner for the, the friendshoring sometimes. And it became the, the Japan's kind of momentum for the leadership as well. And the kind of third reason, ironically, this is a kind of biggest challenge for Japan, which is declining population. So Japan used to put the more importance in securing employment, but now companies really shifting its focus from securing employment to the securing human resources because we have a very huge deficit in the, the labor forces. So when you take a look at the number of the M&A, you will see that there's a very big surge of the M&A only in Japan in this region. So kind of it means that Japanese companies are ready to kind of change. It's a kind of very traditional employment, the custom, which is based on the lifetime employment and also seniority system. Sometimes it really prevents from Japanese company doing more to boost up the productivity. So there are so many reasons. So okay, but anyway, so my answer to your question about how sustainable it could be, that there's so many skepticism among the market still, how, well, Japan can capture this momentum. I'm also the skeptical one, like other journalist who covers this the country, for the rest of my life. And first, because, many of the kind of factors which created the momentum for Japan is really time limited. As everybody noticed, the BOJ could change the monetary policy maybe by the next spring, so which could have an impact on the interest rates and maybe the forex market as well. And also, as for the geopolitical, the element, it kind of depends on what's going on in the grounds in Ukraine, and also it could be maybe swayed by the U.S. presidential election. What happened if Mr. Trump will be elected, as the next president again? It could have so much impact on the, dynamics, between kind of relationship between China and the U.S. And also, one of the reasons which I really skeptical still, although I have a hope, is still there's a total lack of the diversity in the Japanese kind of politics and the kind of workforce. I can talk about it forever because I can, because I'm kind of living in this country as a woman. With those kind of experience, I've seen the reality where the capable women have to choose to go the foreign country and choose to the work for the foreign company for the opportunity they get deserved. And this is a country where the number of the female politicians and number of the female executives are the smallest number, by far the smallest among the developed countries. And this is a country where the married woman cannot choose your own surname. So sometimes, the new momentum for the real changes should be underwritten by the new way of thinking. So I guess sometimes this is really difficult to kind of see real new way of thinking, coming from the old boys club. So I like to see the kind of breakout, from those kind of traditions as well.
Okay, so we should look at these changes, perhaps, on sustainability in the context of many, many different moving parts that we see here. And your point on diversity, I think Japan is one of the very few advanced economies where an old white man like myself can be seen as a sign of diversity. Sometimes. Shikata-san, a couple of your predecessors ago, when I was in PR consulting, came to us and said, we have a problem. The Prime Minister goes to the United States and he holds press conferences and we hand out copies of the speech, but the foreign media, the US media, just doesn't cover us. What can we do to have a little bit more interest? But you've been traveling recently with the Prime Minister on a number of trips overseas. What can you tell us about the sense of interest in Japan that you're seeing through those travels?
Well, since I was told to join this panel this morning, I'm not prepared. But as Ross told us, I have been traveling with Prime Minister Kishida, joining his administration from day one. So it's been the last 2 years, and I wish to just introduce some of those diplomatic trips overseas, and especially during the last half a year. And of course, this year is the year for Hiroshima G7 summit, and Governor Yuzaki is there, and he's been a great host for international leaders, and we see, that Hiroshima is getting so much attention, globally, and the governor was telling me that so many international visitors are coming to Hiroshima. And that's, I guess, in terms of communication strategy, it was a good choice, a wonderful choice for Prime Minister Kishida to appeal the issue of his political lifetime agenda items of pursuit of the world without nuclear weapons. Let me just illustrate some of the examples. For example, before G7 Hiroshima Summit, PM Kishida visited 4 African countries. And we heard various viewpoints regarding global issues, such as when we talk about Russian invasion against Ukraine, and basically we are lobbying, for their support, of Global South to be against Russia's invasion. But at the same time, their response could be there are other acute food security or food shortages, energy price hikes, and so forth. So how could we contribute to addressing those issues, facing the so-called Global South is a very important agenda item, which ended up with a major pillar of G7 Hiroshima Summit's agenda. And at the same time, I heard, say, lots of African opinion leaders telling me that why Japanese companies are no longer investing as much as they used to. And there are more Chinese companies, Korean companies, and Japanese companies need to be more aggressive. Their viewpoint comes from the case, that Japanese investments could offer very constructive solutions. And that's something which already felt very widely in ASEAN countries. When we go there, there are lots of good quality infrastructure projects. And some people compare between Belt and Road Initiative related projects, and there are debt trap issues and so forth. So maybe Japan is now presenting the solutions, reaching out beyond G7 countries, Global South countries, and late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's proposal for free and open Indo-Pacific is resonating across the world, and PM Kishida is implementing those projects in ASEAN connectivity, or when we go to India, we are talking about northeastern India connecting with Bangladesh. So these are the new emerging opportunities for Japanese business, and they will benefit sustainable development of those emerging economies. So from my viewpoint, kind of pushing those agenda items in close collaboration with the business is so important. And this is, in a sense, the kind of endless exercise. Collaboration, partnership with the local governments, private sectors, NGOs, among others. Thank you.
And are you finding, as you travel with the Prime Minister, that those messages are resonating and that people are thinking very positively about those in the context of the global experience?
Sure. So when we go to European countries, we went to NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania, and Belgium, Japan, EU summit. The message from Prime Minister Kishida that today's Ukraine could be tomorrow's Asia resonates. And we are making this case from a straightforward perspective, that European security landscape could significantly influence Asian security landscape. Another point is, over 2 weeks ago, PM Kishida was giving the economic policy speech, and he was inviting asset managers to Japan. And so last week, there were so many asset managers, including Mr. Larry Fink of BlackRock. And when I kind of engaged with a discussion conversation with them, it seems that there is a genuine increased interest in investments in Japan, and it's probably influenced by geopolitical landscape and also the emerging government policy, I think.
Thank you. Noah, has your experience been that Japan is boring, and is it getting any more exciting?
Well, I think it's important for the purposes of this panel to make a clear distinction between investor interest, which is driven by the question of do you see an opportunity to make money, and reader interest, which is about is this place relevant? Is there something I can learn from spending my time reading about one or another country or topic? And I think when it comes to Japan, there really are two stories that big kind of meta stories that people have been telling for a really long time, and that still have a lot of pull in the minds of readers in the rest of the world. One is essentially the Japan passing narrative, that Japan is a country in kind of terminal decline, that it has a shrinking population, it has a sclerotic business sector, it's less and less dynamic compared to its peers. The second story is that Japan is intriguing, is exciting, is a great place to have a nice travel experience and eat good food, but that basically it's a different planet. That it's so different as to be irrelevant to serious policy discussions happening elsewhere in the world. So both of these narratives lead people to say that actually Japan is not relevant to me as a reader. And I think that what we've seen, or certainly just to speak for myself and our coverage at The Economist, is the emergence of a different frame. We've been trying to say, what if we think about Japan as relevant, and think about the challenges that Japan faces, which led people to a kind of pessimistic narrative, to see those as shared challenges, and Japan is at the kind of the front line of dealing with some of those challenges. And it's not to say that Japan has figured out the answers to them, or that Japan is surpassing, but it's to say that what's happening in Japan matters to readers in the rest of the world. And I think that framing and that idea does resonate with certainly with our readers, and has generated more interest in what we've been writing from Japan. I think a lot of that has to do with changes in the external conditions, in the external environment, and we can get into some of that in more detail. But at the same time, I think it's important not to overestimate the extent of that interest from a sort of journalistic point of view, looking at our pages. The stories that get the most reader interest are still about China, about America, in the context of the Asia section where Japan coverage in The Economist lives. India now is generating a lot more interest than Japan. And the old narratives still have a certain enduring power, in part because there are kernels of truth to them. So just by way of example, by far the most read story about Japan that was published in the first half of this year was a piece which is essentially a story of Japan in decline. It was a piece about how the Japanese auto industry is losing the global EV race. So I think we need to temper our potential enthusiasm with that recognition.
Your point about India for me was particularly resonating because I think when we're here in Japan, and maybe it is sort of a different planet, we get very wrapped up in the Japan sort of narrative, and sometimes we forget that it's still a competitive world out there, and whatever interest is in Japan is, it may be the product of less interest in China or a different type of interest in China, but we also have a rising India and other parts coming through.
Absolutely, and I think the one of the challenges for Japan and for journalists telling the story of Japan is that Japan doesn't lend itself to the modern 24-hour news cycle. It really doesn't. It's not a splashy place. It's not a place where change happens in big visible ways, dynamic ways. And so I think in terms of the competition, even within a single news organization, what gets put on the cover, what gets put at the front of any given section, the places where things seem to be happening with more urgency and with more immediacy, that's always going to win out. And so that is a challenge, I think, for Japan. It's harder to tell a compelling story about stability.
I think my team gets constantly tired and frustrated with the number of times I say, we need to move at the speed of news. It's just seems to be still the speed of news when there was a morning edition and evening edition. Bill, from your perspective and where you sit overseas, how are you seeing interest in Japan developing?
Well, I suppose, so my perspective, Ross, is one, I'm the other old white guy with a beard on the panel, right? So the journalist emeritus, if you like. But secondly, yes, I'm based in Ireland and the UK. I think that the framework that Noah has put is absolutely right. That with Japan has always coverage of Japan in all the 40 years I've been covering it, basically has always been tugged between the notion of Japan as extraordinary, Japan as exceptional, sometimes weird, sometimes wonderful, sometimes exemplary, but anyway, exceptional. And of course, that is a narrative that is often encouraged by Japanese institutions, by Japanese dialogue and so forth. And the other narrative, which is Japan as relevant. I mean, Japan as central. Japan as the center of the story. Now, in the 1980s, if you like, the heyday of addiction to Japanese coverage, the point is that Japan was both exceptional and central because it was the rival, US-Japan rivalry was the key thing. Now, then the time when Japan got put most often on the cover of The Economist, yeah, okay, I was editor at the time, but also it was when I'm afraid the bubble had burst and bad news was coming. So fast forward to now, what do I see as distinctive about today? I think it is, and most sustainable about today, I think principally it is framed by the headline that actually was a special report that Noah did in The Economist, 2 years ago, and the headline was "On the Front Line." So I think that a lot of the added attention is really about geopolitics, it's about defense, it's about the sense that Japan is on the front line of an incredibly important set of geopolitical events. And that obviously is encapsulated by the national security documents, by the defense build-up and so forth, also by the phrasing of Prime Minister Kishida about Ukraine today is East Asia tomorrow. And I think that's the most sustainable part. And that does come through very much to, if I go parochial, what is it that's making Japan important to the UK and in the UK? Well, there's one reason, which is that Brexit means that we don't have any friends anymore, and we basically are grateful for every friend we can get, and Japan is the best friend that we have. But the more serious...
I think there's this guy in North Korea called Kim that's looking for friends.
Yeah, no, he's Donald Trump's friend. He can't be ours. No, but seriously, defense is the basic reason why there is a strong and now deepening UK-Japan relationship. It's all about defense industry collaboration. It's all about the Joint Combat Air Project. It's all about then reciprocal access agreements. Japan is the way in which the UK can have some influence in the region, also through CPTPP, but also in terms of Indo-Pacific security. So defense is the framework, I think, for the way we see. Now, I think that this part is absolutely sustainable. The investment part, I think we should be skeptical about, not because it's necessarily just a wind that's going to blow through quickly, but rather that that's what investors are like. You know, they move on to the next fashion, and there is a paradox in the fact that, well, actually a strangeness in the fact that those sports teams have written to you looking for sponsorship, and they haven't noticed that it's especially expensive for you at the moment because of the yen, right? And that you're actually a pretty bad person to ask. And so the paradox is the decline of the yen, which makes makes Japan a cheap investment, but also means there's a potential 20-30% upside to add to any actual return upside If that happens or it basically is disappointed, then the investors will just move on somewhere else. Whereas the defense interest, I think, absolutely is going to be there. Final point I'd make is that we perhaps should be careful not to think of this only in a Western media point of view. I like to think of The Economist, of course, as a global media, but nevertheless, we have a tendency to measure interest in Japan and whether there's interest in the United States and in Europe, whereas isn't the more important issue as to what's the interest in Southeast Asia, and the interest in India, the interest in Republic of Korea. And I would say that is higher and quite sustainable because of a sense that Japan understands the region and actually has a lot of things to contribute. And whether it contributes to them or not is going to be a very central issue, critical or praising. So yeah, anyway, that's enough for me for the moment.
Thank you. Toyoda-san, you referred to the concept of Japan seizing the moment, that we have this momentum at the moment, and Japan needs a moment. And Bill has said that the two key narratives that he's seeing are one around the defense narrative and the other the economic narrative, one perhaps being more sustainable than the other in his view. Is there a third narrative, which is what I'll put as the cultural narrative? So we still see an incredibly strong degree of interest in tourism into Japan. It's rebounded relatively quickly since opening the borders again. We still see a lot of interest in Japanese content, anime and other things like that. So is there a softer narrative that's also there? And is there a narrative about change as we see the sort of the generational change? I've seen a couple of articles recently from some of the media talking about the fact that Japan is really on the cusp of change and exploring whether that change is positive or negative in the broader sense. Noah, would you like to?
Yeah, I think the cultural piece is always an area of interest. The danger with it is that it slips into what Bill rightly described as the sort of weird Japan narrative. But absolutely, there's a lot of reader interest in Japanese culture and a lot of tourist interest, sort of potential. It's an avenue for people to connect with Japan, certainly. I think the question of sort of is Japan changing, the generational change narrative or the new Japan, I think this is something that's just sort of starting to emerge, and I think there is, I mean, in one sense, obviously generational change is happening. It's inevitable, and none of us will stop it. I will become the old white man with a beard on the panel soon enough. But the question of whether it adds up to meaningful change in ways that alter the structure of Japanese society, Japanese business, Japanese policy making, I think is still very much an open question, and there are many reasons, as Toyoda-san mentioned, that sort of suggest it's not happening. But I think to look a bit more closely, I think there's a difference between what's happening in the private sector and in many of the sort of startup companies that are represented at this conference, and in what's happening in Japanese politics and in the kind of traditional Japan Inc. So I think the narrative is emerging, and partly it's a question of how far the process actually gets in Japanese society.
A friend of mine, his son recently joined Honda, and his dad commented to him, "Why would you join a car company?" And his son looked at his dad and said, "Dad, it's a space company." And there was just a total disconnect between the two different views of Honda. And as some people know, I'm quite passionate about the image, about the narrative around hidden immigration in Japan. So Japan has no immigration, but you can go up to places in Saitama and Gunma and places, and you only have to walk into a convenience store to see that Japan actually has a very viable and vibrant foreign community. I think in Shinjuku this year, more than 50% of the young kids at the coming-of-age ceremony were non-Japanese. And I think that the reason I make this point, I think that Japan is very good at doing things without talking about them. And sometimes that creates a sort of a legacy narrative that needs to be brought out into the open a little bit more. Toyoda-san, you said about seizing the moment. What sort of narratives can you see about seizing the moment for Japan? Because you used to be a journalist with a Japanese organization, and maybe there's a little bit of a different perspective there.
It's a very difficult question to answer because kind of it's kind of that has so much relation to the your first question about how sustainable these momentum or the momentum for the change could be. So as I said, I think that many of the drivers which creates the momentum for Japan now is really time limited. So in that sense, Japan has to kind of show how speedy it can take an actions. And the kind of how kind of the revive Japan can do to revive the animal spirit. So it takes more kind of bolder action and the kind of bolder kind of communication to kind of send a more clear message. What Japan can offer and how attractive Japan can be. For the not only for the investors but also for the kind of human resource in general. So kind of I've seen some positive changes from the the government, maybe thanks to the Shikata-san's the skillful navigation in the press or something, but sometimes it lacks the clarity. And it is kind of, the really talking inside of the, the room. So we have to, I really want to see the government more kind of promote itself in a more clear way. For example, South Korea has been really doing a good job in that sense. As you notice, they are really good salesmen to kind of sell their soft power, including K-pop or K-drama, which international kind of, it's really high demand internationally. And they even go all the way to sell its military equipment to the Middle East and in India. And the government has so much things to do, to play the part. So kind of we like to see the more integrated cooperation between the private sector and the public sector to sell Japan and what it can offer. And also, so in this regard, as Shikata-san mentioned, maybe we have to kind of, give the high regard to the, Kishida-san's effort to, to sell Japan as a kind of investment-free, friendly, the country. But maybe it requires a more bolder message. The Japanese may be ready to, to offer the, maybe the tax break to kind of invite more cooperation and more kind of people and kind of ready to kind of give more diversify the workforce to work on maybe the foreign people as well.
It's a really interesting point because in the world we live in today, we are so bombarded by information from all sorts of sources. So, the average person, adult person, sees over 5,000 advertisements in one day. You don't notice them, but that's the number you're seeing on the web and all sorts of places. You're just bombarded with this information. And so messages naturally have to be bolder and they have to be more impactful in order to actually break through. And as I think, Noah, you pointed out, stability is a hard message to be bold about in some times. Shikata-san, more boldness, more clarity.
Of course, Prime Minister Kishida has been talking about the new form of capitalism. And I often get the questions, what is it, right? And then I try to explain, there are three major challenges: income inequality, the gap between the center and the local regions, countryside, and number three, climate change, to put it simply. And then, of course, PM Kishida is advocating for creating ecosystem in Japan in terms of startup. And he wants to promote international cooperation with like-minded countries, including the United States, on, say, university cooperation, on semiconductor, AI, quantum, among others. But of course, this policy message may not resonate, itself. So what I'm trying to kind of personally, work on is to come up with concrete examples. So these days, TSMC in Kumamoto, you're seeing, the increasing wages for workers in Kumamoto. That's good news. Governor Yuzaki told me that Micron investment in Hiroshima is going well, I guess, and Hokkaido, Rapidas, and so forth. So those are good news, and the government is coming up with a straightforward message on this. And another example is green transformation. There are energy experts in this session, and Japan, I think, can provide sound energy transition or green transition solutions to countries in Southeast Asia or India. And so, and this requires concrete cooperation with companies, Japanese companies and other probably global companies. Asian demand is so huge that we need to come on board together. And so this is the kind of issues that I wish to kind of lead to a concrete narrative on successful examples. Thank you.
Great. We're just about coming up to time for the Q&A session, but before that, I'd like to ask each of you, first of all, to the journalists and journalist emeritus. If you had the chance to interview any person in Japan at the moment, who would that person be? What would you ask them? And to Shikata-san, if you had 1 hour with the media in a captured room where they couldn't ask any questions for 1 hour, what would your narrative to them be? Bill, maybe we'll kick off with you.
Okay, it's a very difficult question. I think, the first answer I thought of when you said you were raising this question was that I'd like to interview Johnny Kitogawa. And the reason is because I think these bastards basically shouldn't get away with it by dying. And they should have a good interview with a proper journalist. Now, since he is dead, what the interview I would actually be able to do would be with senior editor at one or other major Japanese newspaper, and I would ask them, how did you sit on this story for 50 years?
There was once a movie called Interview with a Vampire. Perhaps we could state that. Noah.
Well, when you posed this question, I thought, is this interview on the record or off the record? Is this person going to tell me what they actually think, or are they going to say what they can say? I would love to interview Masa Son, and I'd love to ask him what he thinks about innovation in Japan, and whether any of this change that we're talking about, this generational shift, these structural sort of forces are making Japanese companies, Japanese innovation look competitive in a global landscape.
Great. Toyoda-san.
Yeah, actually, my answer is the same with Noah. There are many, good business leaders in Japan, but, of course, Son-san is the one whom we like to interview with, because AI could be another driver, for the Japan to keep the momentum for the changes, of course, because of the, the population challenges and as such. And according to him, in 10 years, the AI will surpass all of the, human knowledge combined. So I like to kind of hear his views on what is the best case scenarios and worst case scenarios and what condition to be met for Japan. But, it's kind of, the really Son-san is high demand. So if I can allow myself to kind of ask, to tell another list of the, people whom I like to interview with, is a kind of female politicians in LDP. I like to kind of, ask, directly to them why they are not so, the supportive of promoting the female rights. Yeah.
And Shikata-san, a room full of journalists, and we'll even put some air in the room, which means they have to write what you tell them.
Okay. Well, actually, this is a background briefing, and you can't quote my name and affiliation, but I have a kind of private or personal idea. Of course, Japanese government or Governor Koike have been promoting this idea of making Tokyo International Financial Center. And from my kind of role as a media relations, I think there is a good window of opportunity to have major international media companies like Thomson Reuters or the Economist Group to have a stronger presence in Tokyo and pay better, right? My case is having lived in London. Of course, London is international financial center or European, or after Brexit, I don't know what it is, but still it has the international media, like The Economist. Thomson Reuters is, I know, Canadian, but anyhow, yeah, global company. So it's my case is it's very important to have a good combination of international financial center function and international media function, and like so-called hub, and that requires better international education in Tokyo. We are gradually seeing more opportunities in Tokyo and other parts of Japan, but personally, I think there is much room for our efforts, and GLOBIS, with the G1 Global, is coming up with a model example.
Great, thank you. So we're a couple of minutes early, but we'll turn to questions from the audience. You were very quick to put up your hand there.
So good afternoon. I have a question about the speech given by Prime Minister a couple of days ago on New Economic Club of New York. Like he wanna launch a project about like only English is required for the special investment zone. Did you see any challenges in implementing that project? Like for example, the deregulation or regulatory change? Thank you.
I think Shikata-san, if you can kick us off with that.
I understand that our financial service agency is working on this project in terms of coming up with concrete, maybe some kind of special zones for such investment and the zones for asset managers coming from overseas, including the United States and the UK and others, and make all those transactions complete in English. And this is in the process of its making, and I hope that you'll be seeing more concrete, plan during the next a few or at least several months.
Does anyone else want to comment on that? No? Okay, we'll move up to another question. Okay, at the back there.
Right, this would be for Shikata-san. It seems to me that Japan owes a great debt to Ukraine, particularly since the invasion seems to have stopped China in its tracks and forced them to reconsider their position on Taiwan and the feasibility of an invasion. My own view is, given the history of amphibious invasions, it's not something that I'd like to try, and it looks as if their military maneuvers are really more around a blockade than an invasion. Given the uncertainty in the United States right now and Japan's record of supporting, for example, the invasion of Iraq financially, for which it really didn't get the full credit that it should have, can you see a situation where Japan would substantially increase its support to Ukraine? And the question behind the question is, obviously Japan is sitting on the outside of the Five Eyes alliance, and I have a sneaking suspicion that it would be in the interest of both parties for Japan to enter that program rather than to be on the outside.
Well, thank you. I was attending kind of interagency meeting on expanding support for Ukraine in preparation for Japan-Ukraine kind of economic cooperation meeting to be held in Japan in early part of next year. And we are looking at specific sectors like energy sector before severe winter arrives, and agriculture, and also, startup companies are coming on board. There is a genuine interest among some Japanese startup companies to invest in Ukraine, although it's kind of challenging. So we need to collaborate with the neighboring countries of Ukraine, including Poland or Romania and others. We are looking into very specific projects. And of course, Prime Minister Kishida visited Ukraine in March. He visited Kyiv and Bucha. And for Bucha, we have been providing, the batteries and so for winter time. And so we will be committed to supporting Ukraine for some time to come. President Zelensky's kind of request is Japan has lots of experiences in reconstruction, like look at Tohoku. So those expertise could be better use of, and that's something we are attentive to. Of course, you see in the newspapers or media about the request of high-speed rail, maybe Shinkansen in Ukraine. Well, like that may take some time, but there are transportation projects being kind of proposed. Thank you.
Anything on Five Eyes?
So, yes.
Okay. Well, of course, we are not in a position, to dictate our, 5 countries' friends, and there are, as you know, different groupings. For example, I talked about G7 countries, and we are one of the members of Quad, 4 countries. And we are increasingly collaborating among Japan, US, ROK, Korea, or Japan, US, and the Philippines. So, of course, we do, have the intelligence or information sharing with like-minded countries, especially with the United States, but with countries like the UK, of course. We have arrangements, and we are stepping up our cooperation. So among Five Eyes, all the Five Eyes countries are our very, very good and close friends.
Okay.
Thank you. The focus of the discussion has obviously been on interest levels outside of Japan, in the Japan story. I'm just interested in reversing that. How interested do you think people in Japan are in the outside world? And those two things are interlinked, right?
Good question. Toyoda-san.
In general, Japanese readers are really interested in whatever happened in the outside world, because of the, the very detailed reporting, from the Japanese media and ours as well. And nowadays, especially, Japanese are really quite keenly interested in whatever happened in Ukraine, because as Shikata-san kind of mentioned that, whatever happening over there could happen, to Japan and Taiwan in Asia. So kind of, Japan see the kind of parallel, the narrative over there. So kind of also, the whatever, the Chinese are doing is also the very, attract a strong interest from Japan. Because everything, China has to do with a huge impact on a Japanese business and also the Japanese kind of, the sometimes, the social life as well. So kind of, because many of the Japanese think that the Chinese are really now the threat, so they are really want to know, what's really going on inside of the China, especially, and of course, United States as well.
Noah, would you like to comment on that?
Well, Toyoda-san, I think, has a much clearer perspective on it, having worked in Japanese media. But I would just say that I've been struck by the enduring interest in Ukraine, having covered Ukraine and Russia before myself. The amount of attention Japanese media has paid to the conflict, even as it has sadly dragged into its second year, is quite striking and stands in contrast, for example, to other parts of of the region, where there's just less awareness and less interest. So I think I see that as a sign of an understanding amongst Japanese news consumers, at least, that what happens in the rest of the world is matters for their lives here in Japan.
I sometimes get the sense that for the younger generation, they've been told that Japan is so boring and uninteresting and depressed for so long. They actually have greater interest in what's going on outside Japan than they do what's going on in politics and other issues in their own country. I find that to be quite both amazing and quite disturbing at the same time. Yuzaki-san.
Well, thank you. At the opening plenary, we had some discussion about disinformation, misinformation, and manipulation of election. And it doesn't look like, it's not really happening in Japan. Is it happening? Or if it's not happening, why is it? Is it because of the Japan passing or any other reason?
Because of my job, I am an avid TikTok fan, and I can assure you that if you spend an hour on TikTok, you will discover all sorts of content that looks very much like propaganda in trying to shape forms. Shikata-san.
Very briefly, after the release of Alps treated water, from Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, we have identified disinformation, misleading social media postings, especially in China and in South Korea. Of course, as you know, the South Korean government has been supporting Japanese government measures, and to the contrary, Chinese reaction has been very out of bounds from other, the members of IAEA or other the international community members.
Bill or Noah, would you like to comment on?
Only that I certainly don't think it's true that Japan's immune to it. No, I mean, from all sorts of sources, I absolutely think it's a common phenomenon.
Yeah, you had your hand up from before.
Well, the Russian war against Ukraine has united Europe, including United Kingdom, and it has been very well noticed what Japan has said. At the same time, you have the debate in the US with others. But how do you handle countries like India, South Africa, and most of Africa, Brazil, and all those countries that are of a different opinion when you have taken such a positive stance on the side of Europe against Russia?
I think that falls to you again, Shikata-san.
It's turning into a press conference.
So I mentioned G7 summit, and of course, Prime Minister Kishida extended kind of invitation to other so-called global South countries, including the chair of the African Union or chair of ASEAN, chair of South Pacific, Islands the forum. Of course, it's the case that there are really different views, and there are developing countries, global South countries, who respond, that there are other urgent issues, that they face, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine has not really impacted, their economies and so forth. But we need to keep on trying, and it so happens in many cases, for example, when we go to African countries or Middle Eastern countries, Asian countries, their leaders tend to listen to us, I think. And so we try to come up with kind of constructive, case that there is so much that we can collaborate, together. And that's something, at the Hiroshima summit, we included food security agenda item with invited, leaders to discuss common challenges.
Okay, we have 4 minutes left. Does anyone have a question that all of the panel can address? You have one? Let me see. Okay, I know you've had your hand up a number of times.
I think it's a continuation of this same question, but what I wanted to highlight is that Russia seems to be exploiting the rise of far right in Serbia, Hungary, and recently Slovakia, and the renewed anti-colonial sentiments in Africa and the bitterness of most of the Middle Eastern countries towards the US and Europe to create a new curtain of influence around the European G7 countries. So my question is, how can Japan use its soft power and contribute to fighting this creeping influence?
I'll relieve Shikata-san from the need to answer that question for a second. I think on this issue, one should make a clear distinction between those who voted for or against the condemnation of the invasion at the United Nations, which was the vast majority of countries in the world, and secondly, those who think that they should actually act to do something about it. Now, I think that obviously the number in the second category is much smaller, but that doesn't mean that they're not persuadable to be broadly sympathetic. And I think that Japan in particular, probably better than a European or country or America, but America should also try, needs to get across the message repeatedly, A, that it's in our mutual interest to try to establish certain principles of behavior in international relations and to keep reinforcing those rules. And secondly, that we can help you if with whatever problems you have. Now, of course, the Gulf is very happy to buy rather a large number of F-35s from the United States and also to have a rather large number of American and British forces based in the Gulf. So we shouldn't say that they're suddenly being moved in the opposite direction. But there are positive messages that we can and should give. Obviously, Russia is going to try to argue what it wants to argue. And I think Japan and the others need to be confident about offering those messages in a respectful way.
One minute left. Who has a quick question? Okay.
Just trying to go back to the being positive about Japan and your point, some concrete examples. For example, we have the aging society, but Japan now is the world leader in lots of products coming out. For example, tokozore, they have the world's best beds now for tokozore, right? They've created a new product for enge, when the pneumonia, food goes down into your stomach, and into your lungs and stays there. 70% of people are dying from that pneumonia, not normal pneumonia. They have products now which predict, is that going to happen or not? So I think you should be out there talking positive about the products coming out of Japan for the aging society. That is very concrete. Big infrastructure is great, but this hits everybody who's out there in the world looking at Japan as the world leader in aging, right? I think there's a big message for you there.
A great example is Tetra Pak. A lot of the packaging for older people that Tetra Pak developed in Japan is now being exported to other countries with aging populations. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I would just say, I think in addition to what Bill mentioned at the beginning of the session, that security is a theme that's going to be of enduring interest. I think the other big one is demographic change. It's something that hit Japan first, but that a large swath of the developed world and even the sort of middle income countries is now facing, and Japan's experience, as you say, can be instructive in all kinds of ways. Japanese products or services can be useful, and the challenge, I think, both for companies but also for us in the media is to figure out ways to tell those stories that get readers interested. As wonderful as those products are, reading about your potential pneumonia and the ways you might die is not a great way to get readers interested. So it's a big challenge for us in the media, and I think maybe a takeaway from this panel to think about how to tell the demographic change story in a way that is compelling, because I agree it's tremendously important.
And that brings us up to time. Thank you everyone for joining us and for the excellent questions.